What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with the most dangerous mutant in Marvel in Dungeons of Doom. Now, Dungeons of Doom is an anthology comic, so multiple stories within one single comic book, and it is a 3-issue limited series, so this is only issue number 1. The next 2 will be released in the coming months. So, what this first one does is it opens up and it says Latveria, right? Once called the Jewel of the Balkans, a place of mirth, culture, and natural beauty. In modern times, it holds less flattering titles: The Monster's Den, The Iron Jewel, Doom's Shadow. Victor Von Doom is dead. His strongholds lie empty. His people are leaderless. Allies, rivals, enemies, and vassals alike scramble to gather up his leavings, for who can know what secret treasures Doom was hiding within its walls. Now, one of the things that I want to specify, for those of you guys who were kind of joining us for the first time with regards to what's been happening with Doom, we just finished One World Under Doom. I'll have a whole playlist for it down in the description. You're welcome to check it out, and then we'll pin it as a comment to make it easier to find. The idea behind One World Under Doom was effectively Doom had taken power. He had become the new Sorcerer Supreme following Bloodhunt, and then at the end of One World Under Doom, he died. Certainly not the first time that's happened in Marvel Comics. This, in fact, is kind of a repeat of Fantastic Four issue number 200, to be honest, so something akin to what happened in Fantastic Four annual number 15 will likely take place in the future. But the point is, Doctor Doom's entire kingdom is now leaderless, and so what's happening here is exactly what you would expect: a combination of civil wars and various entities out there all vying for whatever Doom had within his kingdom. Because as most of you guys probably know, even if you're not overly familiar with Doctor Doom in Marvel Comics, he guarded Latveria jealously, right? You didn't just simply walk in to Latveria and start plundering its resources. Doctor Doom would toss you in a prison or just outright kill you. But without him there, now it's ripe for the pickings. And so when you see these groups fighting against one another, right? One of them says Latveria is ours, not Doom's, and never the West's, right? These are Latverian nationals, Latverian soldiers. The second group is basically American soldiers, right? We're pushing back the freedom fighters, sir, but if we use mortars, we risk a cave-in, right? And this guy says, freedom fighters, if those mud farmers wanted freedom, Major, they'd be welcoming us. Take that gate by any means, right? In the midst of all of this, when these groups are going against each other, Hydra shows up, right? And in fact, one of the guys is just like, what the hell hit us, right? And then they look up and realize Hydra's flying in with jets, and Hydra just kind of broadcasts out to everybody, right? Well done, peasants, maim and kill each other. All that was Doom's is now Hydra's. And so Hydra just says, right, take down that gate, kill anyone we find inside. And so the Latverians are holding off as best they can, but they don't really have the same resources that Hydra has, and certainly not the same resources that an American-backed military has, whether they're American soldiers or simply just supported by the US military. And so with Hydra just firing in on all these soldiers, right, one of them says, Alexei, we cannot stay here. Get up. And that's where Alexei says, we can't let them take the stronghold. We will kill any who try. And again, US soldiers, right? We've got Hydra, sir. They're taking the gate. We need air support. And that's where this guy who's kind of leading the charge says, fine, I will do it myself, just like I always do. And we find out it's Thunderbolt Ross. It's Red Hulk, right? Who shows up here. Now, Red Hulk does have a personal vendetta against Doom that was all kind of covered during One World Under Doom. But the important thing here is that he shows up and starts taking out Hydra agents, these Hydra craft, everywhere he can. But as you can tell, the entire place has fallen into a state of disarray. Now, it's not like the entire world is descending on Hydra, but there are a lot of forces here, some of which we see, and some of which we won't see until we get to the end. But what we end up doing here is picking up with Chapter 1, the Whisper Man. And this is that mutant that I was telling you guys about, right? That what you end up doing is picking up with these soldiers, right? The Red Hulk and these guys, right? And one of them calls out, right? Woods, Sergeant Major Woods. Anyone who can hear me, sound off, right? So they basically start calling out their names so that we know who it is that's alive. The Red Hulk, of course, emerges as you would expect him to. It's Red Hulk, right? He's not going to be taken out by a cave-in, right? But again, the question's asked, is anybody hurt? And that's what one of the guys is like, all of us probably, right? And it says anybody whose flashlight still works, pull it out. right? And that's when they start to look around and they realize that they're down under Latveria in this exceedingly old dungeon that's reminiscent of the old country. Now, it's one of these parts of Latveria that we haven't really seen before, because more often than not, when you do see Latveria, it's the Baron's castle, the castle that was taken over by Victor Von Doom. This does bear a striking resemblance to the Forever City from Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run, if you know what that means. But the fact is, right, one of these guys says, did anyone know that this was down here? And he's kind of told, not our intel people, and definitely not me. None of our imaging went this deep. And so the question's asked, right, Ross, are you still in comms? And of course, Thunderbolt Ross fires back and is like, are there any other Americans down here? Because keep in mind, despite the fact that Thunderbolt Ross is Red Hulk, he will still do whatever he has to do to protect the lives of American soldiers. He's a general first and a Hulk second, right? So it's not like this whole Bruce Banner, Incredible Hulk dichotomy where the Incredible Hulk kind of operates separate from Bruce Banner with his own schemes, motivations, different things like that. But the whole place kind of starts shaking around them, and it kind of gives the signs of a cave-in. And so the question's asked, like, what in the hell was that? And that's where one of the guys says, it's Thunderbolt Ross doing what he does. Even before he was a Hulk, he would have brought the roof down on us, right? So let's move. We are not helpless. At least one of these doors is a way out. And so they start making their way through this whole facility. And this guy says, one of these doors has broken open. And so they ask the question, is anyone down here? But when they get inside, it's almost kind of like this just twisted and sadistic laboratory on the inside. You've got a guy that's just like hanging from chains, right? You've got basically his body parts, organs and whatnot that are just in jars all over the place, the organs of other people who were there. It's pretty twisted, right? And that's where this voice just kind of comes out of nowhere and says, this is the voice of Professor Charles Xavier. If you are hearing this message, you have tripped a proximity alarm. Turn back. This room was never meant to be opened. It holds an organism beyond your comprehension, a mutant who should never have been born. And then at that point, we cut to chapter 2 and a whole different group. We get left on a pretty significant cliffhanger regarding that story, right? And so the second group picks up with the Latverian freedom fighters, right? And initially, they're just kind of like pulling these guys out of the rubble. Specifically, it's Sophia being pulled out of rubble. Now, Sophia is a new character introduced in this comic, so don't feel bad if you don't recognize the name. And that's where Alexander tells her, right, you were lucky. And she just kind of coughs out some dirt and is just kind of like lucky. And he's like, yeah, like not all of us made it because one guy got impaled on a whole bunch of spikes. And so they're ultimately called over to another location and they end up finding a Hydra agent who's trapped down here in the rubble and just smashed to pieces. And so they ask the question, right, what do we do with him? And the question's asked, right, why are you here? And this Hydra agent just says, you don't even know what you're guarding, do you? But you are about to find out. And then goes to like attack him with a knife and Alexander just kills this guy on the spot. And so he just says, let's go. Alexander's pretty badass, right? This guy's pretty dope. And so as they're making their way through here, right, one of the other guys asked the question, where is there to go when you're nowhere, right? We need to get out of here, man. This place is a death trap. And Alexander just says, shut up and remember your dignity. And he says, we could not defend this place. So now our strategy changes. And that's where the question's asked, right? We hunt down the survivors and we ultimately find out this is a guy named Boris. And so Alexander tells Boris, right, you're a big man, but you do not stand a chance against a Hulk. We are in a race now and we have an advantage. Doom killed all the engineers and construction workers who built this facility, but not before they leaked information to a rebel faction. This is the Crypt of Monsters, a place where terrors are buried, but it's also a shortcut. And he says one of these tombs opens up into a passage that will take us to the deepest dungeon, where Doom kept his most closely guarded secrets. And that's where Boris chimes in, and he says, we've talked before about how we can make use of this in our fight for Latveria. But he's told, I need your muscles, comrades. And so they ultimately just end up pushing off the top of one of these tombs. Now, as you guys know, if nothing else than watching The Mummy with Brendan Fraser, you go walking through a crypt and you just start opening up tombs, God only knows what's gonna happen. And that's exactly what happens with these guys, right? They push the top off this thing and immediately this eldritch critter emerges with eyeballs all over the place and just starts attacking everybody. And Alexander's just like, light it up. This guy asks no questions, right? He's like, immediately open fire. One of the guys gets seized by this thing's tentacles and it starts siphoning off this guy's life force, right? It literally kills him on the spot and then just starts going after everybody else. And that's where the statement is made, right? They all have their reasons for being here. The scars they carry that will never heal. Boris watched his parents be electrocuted by doombots. Theodor was tortured. Sophia spent most of her childhood in a work camp. That's where her jaw was torn off and replaced with a scrapped doombot's jaw. And Alexander, he lost his sister, but he sees her presence, right, kind of off in the distance. And that's where he says, here, right, the passage, it's here. And the question's asked, right, how do you know? And he just says, I made a mistake before, but this is the way. I promise. He's following the spirit of her sister. And of course, he also says, like, we have no choice. But it's an important thing to understand here, right? Whenever it comes to Latveria and it comes to Dr. Doom, it's never really as simple as it is in the real world. For example, Mr. Beast goes into some pyramids in Egypt. What's going on, guys? This is Mr. Beast, and in this video, we're just gonna like wake up and disturb some Egyptian curses, right? It's never really anything like that, right? That instead, there's a lot of mysticism that's involved here, tangible mysticism, some of which was conjured by Doom himself, and some of which has seemingly always existed here. There's a lot of mystery and intrigue that surrounds Latveria because it has a very, very long history within Marvel. I would go so far as to say Dr. Doom probably knows them all, but Alexander seeing his sister appear as a spirit would not be that uncommon for a place like this that is so steeped in magic and mysticism. And so at that point, we switch over to chapter 3, specifically with the Hydra agents. And they can't move initially, right? They're just kind of like trapped down inside this ship that's crash landed into the dungeons of Doom. And at the moment, their biggest concern is the Red Hulk, which is why one of them says, right, do you still have your torch? And the other guy's like, I think so. Just let me turn it on. And they end up realizing that one of them is just kind of laying there with a broken back, right? That is Theulus. And so that's where the three of them who are able-bodied basically start pulling Theulus out of this place in order to essentially keep themselves from being crushed to death by the rocks that are on top of them, because they are destroying that little ship that they are in. But once they get out of it and they start looking around, they realize they're also in the dungeons of Doom. But their story is much shorter and far more confined than any of the other stories because they don't really go anywhere. Instead, they're kind of stuck in this room. And one of them looks over and they just see something on an anvil, right? And they ask the question, like, what is that? And this guy just says, it's just an old hammer. And one of them tries to lift it up, but it's incredibly heavy. And he just asks, right, how is it so heavy? It just will not budge. Now, here's the kicker about this, and maybe I'm wrong, somebody correct me if I am, but that looks like Thor's hammer from real-world Norse mythology, right? Not the Thor's hammer that we're familiar with from like Marvel Comics, but like real world, right? A history of Norse mythology from Neil Gaiman, right? That kind of thing, right? It's kind of wild here, but he's just told, leave it, right? Help me find a way out of this place because they're very dismissive of it. And so the question they have is like, what are we going to do about Theulus? And that's where the statement's made. Like, what do you mean do about it, right? There's nothing that we can do for Theulus, right? We're just going to leave him. Now, that's the thing about Hydra. Hydra's cutthroat, right? Hydra is very, very brutal in a lot of ways. In some ways, it's every man for himself, that you uphold the mission of Hydra. And if for some reason you are unable to do that, they will kill you. And so that's where their leader goes for the door, but he can't really move it, right? He's like, I suppose we could try to break through it. And that's where one of them says Theulus is trying to say something, right? And he's just like, oh, is he? Cool. Well, I have something to say as well. And he just kills Theulus on the spot, right? And that's where one of them is like, you really didn't have to do that. And he just says, your objection is noted. Pick up a stone and let's get to work. But that's when he looks over at the table and he's like, did one of you say something? And this guy's like, no, like none of us said anything. And he just says like, I thought I heard a voice. And they asked saying what? And he was like, it was only a whisper, but it sounded like worthy. And he picks up the hammer, right? And so at that point you jump to chapter 4. And this is where things are really cool because it's not really a huge conversation or a scenario. It's just kind of a sequence of events unfolding. And this person says he flies at night. In Wakanda, they call him Umbra. Since the fall of Doom, Latveria has descended into chaos, a war zone of competing forces. Wakanda wants a piece of the land, resources, wealth, and power. But Umbra is not Wakandan, even if he is here at their behest. He wants only one thing. One small thing, and then he will be on his way. His king might be the Black Panther, but he acts alone as he serves another. And he literally lands within Latveria itself, and then just like jumps over to what's basically the opening or the entry point for the Dungeons of Doom. And this voice just says, you have fallen through the Overdark, Umbra, but now you must descend through the Underdark of the dungeons. There, our treasure waits. Kill any who stand in your way. And he just addresses this guy and says, yes, Nagiku. Now, one of the things that I want to specify here, this is a new character. Both of these guys are. So we're kind of stepping into new territory here. That's why I say it's a springboard story, an anthology book, because depending on the popularity of a lot of these themes within this comic, that they may or may not find some measure of storytelling outside of the Dungeons of Doom miniseries. This is one of those times where Marvel's kind of looking at you and asking the question, which of these do you like? They'll make that determination based on comic book sales, but they ask the question, which of these do you like, right? And depending on how people talk, these things may come out of it. And so that's where we're just told, the Dungeons of Doom have been quiet for a long time. They welcome these visitors who must not survive the shadows without and within. So this guy is a hunter. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.